The key went in and stuck. I stood on my own front porch on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 11 days out of a hospital bed, one hand on the door frame to steady myself, and I turned the key I had used to open this door for 22 years, and the lock did not move. My first thought was that I had the wrong key. My second thought was that I had not had the wrong key in 15 years. My third thought came from inside the house, which was not supposed to have anyone in it because I lived alone, and my third thought arrived in the form of footsteps. Someone was walking across my living room floor. I know what footsteps sound like on those floors. 22 years of knowing exactly what footsteps sound like on those floors. These were not mine. The door opened from the inside, and a man I had never seen before in my life was standing in the frame of my own front door, holding a coffee mug, looking at me, not surprised. He said, "Mrs. Calloway?" Not "Who are you?" Not "Can I help you?" Not the words of a stranger who has been caught somewhere he should not be. He said my name, which meant someone had told him to expect me, which meant someone who knew my name and my address and the day I was coming home from the hospital had sent this man to be in my house before I got there. And there was only one person who knew all three of those things: my daughter. My daughter had changed my locks while I was in the hospital. My daughter had put a stranger in my house, and she had not told me any of it. I want to tell you what I found when I finally got inside. I want to tell you what was written on the yellow legal pad on my kitchen table, with my vase moved to the corner to make room for it. I want to tell you what the word subject looks like when it appears in a document written about your own life in your own kitchen by a person you have never met. But before any of that, I need one thing from you. Subscribe right now if you are already sitting forward. This channel stays alive because you are here, and I have the whole story to tell, and it does not end where you think it ends. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with me, because the man at the door was only the first thing. Lauren, who is 34 and who lives 40 minutes away and who I had always believed, with the confidence of a mother who has watched a child grow into a person, that I knew. She visited on the second day and on the seventh day, and both times she sat in the chair beside my bed and asked the right questions and held my hand when the doctor came in and took notes on her phone and told me not to worry. She said, "I am handling everything, Mom." I said, "There's nothing to handle, Lauren. I just need to rest and then I need to go home." She said, "We will talk about that when you are feeling better." I did not fully register those words at the time, because I was tired and medicated and focused on the practical task of recovering, but I have thought about them many times since. The specific shape of that sentence, the "we will talk about that," which is the language of someone who has already had the conversation without you and is waiting for the right moment to tell you what was decided. I did not know that. I know it now. On the 11th day, my doctor discharged me with instructions, a medication list, a follow-up appointment, and the information that I would need to take it easy for several weeks, but that I was cleared to return to my normal life, meaning my home, meaning the house on Birchwood Lane in Columbus, Ohio, that I had lived in for 22 years and where I had raised Lauren and where I intended to continue living until I decided otherwise. A friend named Carol drove me home from the hospital because I had called Carol rather than Lauren. Not for any specific reason, just because Carol had offered. And offering is its own kind of care, and I did not want to bother Lauren on a Tuesday afternoon. We pulled into my driveway at 2:30 in the afternoon. Everything looked normal. The house looked the way my house always looked. The blue shutters I had painted 3 summers ago, the oak tree in the front yard that was the reason I had bought this house in the first place, the garden along the front walkway that needed attention but was not in crisis. Normal. Everything looked completely normal. I got out of Carol's car slowly, the way you get out of cars when you have recently had a cardiac event and your body is reminding you to treat it with slightly more respect than usual. And I walked up the front path and I put my key in the front door lock and I turned it. The key did not turn. I thought I had the wrong key, though I had carried the same keyring for 15 years and there was no version of my life in which I had the wrong key. I tried again. The key went in, which keys do when they are the right key for the lock, but it did not turn. Which keys do not do when the lock has been changed since the last time they were used. I stood on my front porch for a moment and I looked at my key and I looked at my door. And then I heard something from inside the house. Movement. Footsteps. The particular sound of someone walking across the hardwood floors of my living room, which I know intimately because I have been listening to footsteps on those floors for 22 years, and I know how they sound when they are small feet running and when they are teenage feet stomping and when they are adult feet moving with purpose. These were none of those. These were unfamiliar. The footsteps stopped near the door and there was a pause, and then the door opened from the inside and a man I had never seen before in my life was standing in the doorway of my house. He was in his mid-30s, dark hair, wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans, holding a coffee mug, and looking at me with an expression that was not hostile, but was also not the expression of a person who was surprised to find someone on this particular doorstep. He had been expecting me, or not me specifically, but someone. He said, "Mrs. Calloway?" I said, "This is my house." He said, "I know." He said, "Lauren said you would probably come straight here." And those were the words. Lauren said you would probably come straight here. That told me I was not standing in front of a coincidence or a mistake or a burglar or anything that had a simple explanation. My daughter had sent someone to be in my house when I came home from the hospital. My daughter had changed my locks. I want to pause here. Before I tell you who this man was and what he was doing in my house and what Lauren had told him and what I found when I finally got inside, I need a moment from you. If you are watching this and you have already felt the specific quality of what I felt on that porch, that combination of confusion and dread and the beginning of an anger you have not yet given yourself permission to fully feel, then you understand why this story is going to take some time to tell correctly. Subscribe right now if you want to see where this goes. This channel needs you here, and I have the whole story to tell, and it does not end where you think it ends. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with me. Because the man in the doorway was only the beginning. His name was Marcus Webb. He explained, standing in my doorway with his coffee mug and his expression that was not quite apologetic and not quite confident, a social worker. Not a professional social worker from an agency, which is what the word sounds like, but a housing transition coordinator, which is a job title I had never heard before and which he explained meant that he helped families coordinate living arrangements for elderly or medically vulnerable family members during times of transition. He said the word transition twice in his first 4 sentences. I was 58 years old and I had just had a cardiac event and I was standing on my own front porch being told by a stranger about my transition. I said, "I would like to come into my house." He stepped aside. I walked in. The house smelled different. Not wrong exactly, but different the way a space smells when someone else has been living in it. Someone with different habits and different products, and a different relationship to the air inside the rooms. There were things on my kitchen counter that were not my things. A different brand of coffee, a water bottle I did not recognize, a set of keys on the hook by the door that were not my keys. My cat, Oliver, was sitting on the back of the couch looking at me with the specific expression cats use when they have processed something unusual and have decided that calm is the correct response. There was something else I noticed. On the kitchen table, underneath a small vase that was mine and that had been moved to the corner, was a yellow legal pad with handwritten notes. I crossed to it. I read it. It was an assessment. Organized by room. Kitchen, notes about counter heights and cabinet accessibility, a question mark next to the word flooring. Bathroom, notes about the shower and the tub and the grab bar absence. Living room, notes about the rug in front of the fireplace, a note in parentheses that said, remove, a note about the lighting being insufficient. Bedroom, notes. I did not fully read. A final section at the bottom labeled Overall Assessment with a sentence I read twice before I put the pad back down. It said, subject appears to be a good candidate for facilitated transition with appropriate family support and motivation. Subject, I was the subject, and an assessment written in my own kitchen by a man I had never met about a life he had spent less than 2 weeks observing. I was the subject, and the recommendation about me was that I appeared to be a good candidate for facilitated transition. I put the legal pad back under the vase. I put it back in exactly the position I had found it because I did not want Marcus Webb to know I had read it, and I did not want Lauren to know I had read it yet. I needed to have my own knowledge for a few more minutes before it became part of the conversation. Not wrong exactly, but different. The way a space smells when someone else has been living in it. Someone with different habits and different products and a different relationship to the air inside the rooms. There were things on my kitchen counter that were not my things. A different brand of coffee, a water bottle I did not recognize, a set of keys on the hook by the door that were not my keys. My cat, Oliver, was sitting on the back of the couch looking at me with the specific expression cats use when they have processed something unusual and have decided that calm is the correct response. I looked at Marcus Webb and I said, "Where are my keys?" He said, "Lauren has them." I said, "Where's my cat's food?" He said, "It's in the cabinet. I moved it to make room." I said, "Why are your things in my kitchen?" He said, "Lauren asked me to stay here while you were in the hospital." I said, "Why?" And the why was the question that opened everything. He sat down on my kitchen table, which is my kitchen table, and he wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and he explained. Lauren had contacted him 3 days after I was admitted to the hospital. She had found him through what he described as a family transition services network, which is apparently a thing that exists. A category of professional that sits between social work and elder care consultation and helps families make decisions about aging parents who the families have decided can no longer make certain decisions for themselves. Lauren had told Marcus that her mother had been hospitalized with a serious cardiac event, that her mother lived alone, that her mother was stubborn about accepting help, and that she was concerned about her mother's ability to safely return to independent living after the hospitalization. Lauren had asked Marcus to stay in my house while I was in the hospital to assess the property for what she called safety modifications, meaning grab bars and ramp installations and the removal of tripping hazards, meaning my rugs and my furniture arrangements and the general configuration of a home I had lived in safely for 22 years. Lauren had also asked Marcus to be present when I came home so that someone could facilitate the conversation about what she called my next steps. My next steps. My daughter had hired a man to be in my house when I came home from the hospital so that he could facilitate the conversation about my next steps. I sat down across from Marcus Webb at my own kitchen table and I put my hands flat on the surface and I breathed in the way my doctors had taught me. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The breathing of someone who has recently been reminded that their heart requires management. Then I said, "What specifically has Lauren said about my next steps?" Marcus Webb was careful. I give him this. He was a careful man who had clearly been in situations like this before, and who understood that he was sitting between a parent and a child who were about to have a very significant disagreement, and that his job in this moment was to be neutral rather than representative. He said, "Lauren has concerns about your ability to live independently after this hospitalization." I said, "What concerns specifically?" He said, "She is worried about your safety if you have another cardiac event while living alone." I said, "That is a reasonable thing to worry about." I said, "It is also my business to decide what to do with that worry." He said, "Yes." He said it simply and without qualification, which told me something about Marcus Webb that I filed away for later. I said, "Has Lauren arranged for anything else beyond your presence here regarding my house or my living situation?" He looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "She has made some preliminary inquiries about continuing care communities in the Columbus area." Continuing care communities in the Columbus area. The phrase, that means assisted living. That means the place you go when someone has decided you are no longer capable of the life you are currently living. That means the transfer of your daily existence into an institutional setting run by people who do not know the sound of your floors or the way the light moves through your kitchen or the name of your cat. My daughter had been looking at assisted living facilities while I was in the hospital. She had not told me. She had hired a man to stay in my house. She had changed my locks. She had, as far as I could tell, made a series of decisions about the rest of my life without asking me a single question about what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. I picked up my phone and I called Lauren. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been waiting. She said, "Mom, you're home." I said, "Lauren, there's a man sitting at my kitchen table." She said, "I know, that's Marcus. I told you I was handling things." I said, "You told me you were handling things from a hospital room. I assumed you meant you were handling things from a hospital room. I assumed you meant you were handling my mail." She said, "Mom." I said, "You changed my locks." She said, "I had to. There was a contractor coming to assess the accessibility modifications and I needed someone to have a key." I said, "And yet you did not give me a key." Silence. I said, "Lauren, I want you to come here." She said, I was planning to come tonight. I can come this afternoon if you want. I said, I want you to come now. She said, Mom, I know you're upset. I know this feels like a lot, but I did all of this because I love you and I am scared about what happens if you are alone and you have another episode and nobody is there. I said, those are very loving reasons. I said, I look forward to discussing them with you at my kitchen table in my house, which I would like to be alone in for approximately 30 minutes before you arrive so I can reacquaint myself with my own space. She heard the tone. She said she would be there in 45 minutes. I looked at Marcus Webb, who had been sitting very still through this phone call with the practiced stillness of someone who has been the third person in many two-person conversations. I said, Marcus, I appreciate what you are trying to do here, and I do not hold you responsible for the situation, but I would like you to gather your things and your keys and leave my home now, and if Lauren would like to discuss housing transition services, she can do that from her own home on her own behalf with your assistance, but she cannot do it from my home without my consent, and I am withdrawing any implied consent your presence here may have suggested. He stood up immediately. No argument. No appeal. He said, Of course, Mrs. Calloway. He said, I want you to know that I had reservations about this arrangement and I raised them with Lauren. I said, I believe you. He said, I hope the conversation with your daughter goes well. I said, so do I. He left 15 minutes later with his water bottle and his coffee and his keys, and I stood in my house alone and I listened to it. The silence of my own house, the particular acoustic quality of a space that knows you, that has absorbed your rhythms over 22 years, that holds the history of a family in its walls and its floors, and a specific way the light falls in the afternoon. Oliver came and sat on my feet. I looked down at him. I said, what a week. He said nothing because he is a cat, but his presence on my feet was its own kind of answer. I put the kettle on. I found my things in the places I had left them, mostly, though some things had been moved in the way that things get moved when someone else is living in your space and does not know the logic of your arrangements. My reading glasses were on the wrong side of the couch. The throw blanket I keep on the armchair had been folded and placed on a shelf. My plants had been watered, but with slightly too much water, which I could tell from the way the soil looked, which is the kind of knowledge you only have about plants you have been tending for years. Small things. But small things accumulate into the texture of a life. And these small things were telling me that someone else had been living in my texture, and I had not been asked if that was okay. Lauren arrived at 4 in the afternoon. She looked like she had been preparing herself on the drive over, which I recognized because I had watched her prepare herself for difficult conversations her entire life. The specific set of her jaw and the deliberate quality of her breathing and the way she holds her shoulders when she has decided to be the reasonable adult in a situation she expects to become unreasonable. She sat down at the kitchen table in the chair Marcus Webb had recently vacated. I sat across from her. I had made tea for both of us, not because I felt warm toward the conversation we were about to have, but because tea is what I do when I need to give my hands something to hold. I said, "Tell me everything." She said, "Mom." I said, "Lauren." I said it in the voice I have used her entire life when I need her to understand we are past the preamble. She said, "I panicked." She said it plainly, and I heard in it the edge of real emotion. Not the performing of emotion, but the actual kind. The kind that comes from the place in a person that does not know how to be strategic. She said, "I got the call that you were in the hospital, and I drove there, and I sat in the waiting room for 3 hours, not knowing what was happening, and I thought about what it would mean if you didn't come home, and I panicked, and I started making decisions because making decisions was the only thing that made me feel like I had any control over what was happening." I looked at my daughter across the table. I said, "I understand that." She looked up. I said, "I genuinely understand that, Lauren." I said, "I understand that watching your parent go to the hospital is terrifying and that the terror produces the need to act because action feels like protection." She said, "Yes." I said, "And?" She said, "Yes." I said, "And?" She said, "And I went too far." I said, "Tell me what too far looks like from your side." She said she had called Marcus the third day because she had been sitting in her apartment the night before, looking at my house on Google Maps. Just looking at it. Just the aerial image of my roof and my garden, and she had thought about me living there alone, And she had felt, she said, like the walls of the house were too thin, like the distance between me and help was too large, like the 11 days I had been in the hospital were a preview of something she was not equipped to accept. She had looked up housing transition services at 2 in the morning and she had called Marcus the next day. She had not thought of it as making a decision about my life. She had thought of it as gathering information, but information gathering had become. Assessment scheduling had become, contractor visits had become, a man living in my house, and her having the only key and a folder of brochures for continuing care facilities in the Columbus area that she had left in the kitchen drawer and that I had found while I was waiting for the kettle to boil and that I had looked at for a long time before I closed the drawer and walked away from it. I told her I had found the folder. She closed her eyes. I said, "Lauren, how long have you been thinking about this?" She said, "Since Dad died." I heard that and I let it sit. Since her father died 6 years ago. For 6 years, my daughter had been watching me live my life in this house and carrying, quietly, the specific anxiety of a person who has already lost one parent and is trying to figure out how to not lose the other. She said, "I know you're healthy. I know you're capable. I know you don't need someone managing your life." She said, "But every time I leave your house after a visit, I sit in my car for a few minutes before I drive away and I look at the front door and I think, what if this is the last time I see it from the outside? What if something happens between now and the next time I come and nobody knows?" She said, "The cardiac event felt like my nightmare becoming real." She said, "And I know I handled it wrong." She said, "I know I should have talked to you." She said, "I know that changing the locks without telling you was," she paused, "was not okay." I said, "It was not okay." I said, "I want to tell you what it felt like." She nodded. I told her about the key in the lock, about the key going in and not turning, about the moment I understood what had happened. I told her about standing on my own porch and not being able to open my own door. I told her about the movement inside the house, the footsteps, the door opening to a stranger. I told her about the things that had been moved and the rugs that had been evaluated for tripping hazards and the folder in the kitchen drawer. I said, "Lauren, I have lived in this house for 22 years. I said, "I have carried this house through your father's illness and his death and the years after, and I have maintained it and tended it and paid every bill and made every repair and organized every room, and I have done all of that while also working and raising you and building a life that belongs to me." I said, "Coming home from the hospital and finding a stranger in it was one of the most disorienting moments of my life." She was crying. Not the strategic kind. The actual kind. She said, "I know." She said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Mom, I'm sorry." She said, "Mom, I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are." I said, "I also need you to know that being sorry and being done with this pattern are two different things." She looked at me. I said, "This is not the first time you have made decisions about my life that you felt entitled to make because you were scared." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "When you rearranged my kitchen 2 Christmases ago without asking because you thought the layout was inefficient." She said, "That's not the same thing." I said, "When you told my doctor at my last checkup, while I was in the exam room, that you had concerns about my diet without telling me you were going to say that." She said, "I was worried." I said, "When you researched and printed out and left on my counter an article about older women living alone and home security systems without mentioning it, just leaving it there for me to find." She said nothing. I said, "Lauren, I see the pattern." I said, "Every time you were frightened about my mortality, which is something I understand, because I am also sometimes frightened about my mortality, you respond by taking some form of action that is really about giving yourself the feeling of control over something you do not and cannot control." I said that is a human thing to do. I said it is also a thing that, when it involves my home and my keys and my locks and the presence of strangers in my space, crosses a line that I need you to understand is real and cannot be crossed without my consent. She said, "I hear you." I said, "I also want to ask you something." She said, "Okay." I said, "Do you actually think I need assisted living?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No." She said, "No." She said, "No, I don't actually think that." She said, "I think you are a healthy, capable, intelligent woman who had a cardiac event that required medical treatment and who is going to recover from it and live independently for a very long time." She said, I think I have been using the word safety to cover a different word, which is fear. And fear is harder to argue with than safety because fear is not about facts. It is about the thing underneath the facts. And the thing underneath the facts, is that I lost my father and I am not ready to lose my mother, and I have been channeling that into management strategies because management strategies feel like something I can do about it. I said, "That is the most honest thing you have said today?" She said, "I know." I said, "I want us to have a different conversation than the one we have been having for 6 years." She said, "What conversation?" I said, "The one where we both acknowledge that I am 58 years old and that 58 is not 88, and that the fact of my eventual mortality does not constitute a present emergency, and that you are allowed to be scared about losing me and I am allowed to not be managed because you are scared about losing me, and that both of those things can be true without one of them canceling the other out." She said, "Yes." She said, "I want that conversation too." We sat at the kitchen table for another 2 hours. The tea went cold and I made more, and then we moved to the living room, and Oliver distributed himself between us, the way he does when he senses that a room needs settling, half on my lap and half pointed toward Lauren with his front paws, as though supervising the reconciliation. We talked about her father. We had not talked about him in a long time, not really. Not in the way that goes past the surface of remembering him to the deeper level of what his loss had done to each of us and how the doing had changed us. She told me that after he died, she had started checking her phone in the middle of the night to see if I had called. Not because I had ever called her in the middle of the night, because she needed to see that I had not called, which was the same as seeing that nothing had happened, which was the same as the few seconds of peace that comes before the anxiety reassembles itself. She said she had done this for almost a year before she noticed she was doing it. She said she had done it most of the nights I was in the hospital. I said, "Lauren?" She said, "I know." I said, "I did not know any of this." She said, "I know you didn't." She said, "I'm not sure I knew how to say it." She said, "The therapy helped me see it, but seeing it and saying it are still different things, and I am still working on the saying it part." I said, "Say it to me." She looked at me. I said, "When you are scared, say it to me directly instead of expressing it through arrangements I have not consented to." I said, "I am your mother, and I can hear that you are scared without it requiring me to move to a continuing care facility." She said, "I know." She said, "I think part of what I had been afraid of is that if I tell you how scared I am, you will minimize it." I said, "I might." I said, "I probably will, because that is my version of the same thing you are doing, which is managing the feeling through action rather than through honesty." She looked at me. I said, "You manage the fear by arranging things." I said, "I manage the fear by minimizing it." I said, "Neither of us is actually feeling it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No." She said, "No, we are not." She said, "I think I have been so focused on what might happen to you that I forgot to think about what I am doing to you right now." I said, "Yes." I said, "That is exactly right." We sat at the kitchen table for another 2 hours. The tea went cold and I made more, and then we moved to the living room, and Oliver distributed himself between us the way he does when he senses that a room needs settling, half on my lap and half pointed toward Lauren with his front paws as though supervising the reconciliation. We talked about her father. We had not talked about him in a long time. Not really. Not in the way that goes past the surface of remembering him to the deeper level of what his loss had done to each of us and how the doing had changed us. She told me she had been in therapy for the past year. I had not known this. She said she had been working on what her therapist called anticipatory grief, which is the grief you feel about a loss that has not happened yet, and that her therapist had helped her understand that the management strategies she had been using in relation to me were a form of anticipatory grief that had gotten, as her therapist phrased it, a little out in front of her. A little out in front of her. I said, "A man staying in my house while I was in the hospital is a little out in front." She laughed. A real laugh. The kind that surprises you. She said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." She said, "I know." She said, "Marcus is actually a very good professional, and I think under different circumstances, meaning circumstances where I had talked to you first, his services might have been useful." I said, "I will take that under advisement." She said, "That means no." I said, "That means I will take it under advisement." Before she left that evening, she gave me back my keys, not just one copy, 3 copies, which she had made, she admitted, for various contingencies she had been planning. I took them. I said, "Lauren." She said, "I know." I said, "When I need help, I will ask you for it." She said, "I know." I said, "I need you to trust that sentence." She said, "I'm going to try." I said, "That's all I'm asking." She hugged me at the door for a long time, the kind of hug that has more than one thing inside it. I stood on my porch after her car left, and I looked at the oak tree in the front yard, and the garden that needed attention, and the street that had been my street for 22 years, and I breathed in the October air, and I thought about all of it. About fear and love and the ways they wear each other's clothing when you are not paying attention. About the specific vulnerability of being someone's remaining parent and the way that role carries weight you did not ask for and cannot set down. About the distance between wanting to protect someone and the right to make their decisions, which is not the same distance as it looks like from the outside, which is in fact a much larger distance than it appears. I thought about what it would have felt like to come home to those changed locks and that stranger and have nobody who was willing to have the honest version of the conversation. I have the honest version of the conversation. We did not solve everything that afternoon. We have not solved everything in the months since, but we established something that we had not established before, a vocabulary for the thing that had been happening between us, a set of words for the fear and the grief and the management and the boundaries, and having words for things is how you begin to work with them rather than around them. Lauren calls me 3 times a week now, not to check on me, or not only to check on me, but to talk, in the way we used to talk when she was younger and before her father died and before the talking became quietly overlaid with the task of managing my vulnerability. She told me last week about something that happened at work that she found funny, and she laughed telling it, and I laughed hearing it, and Oliver sat on the back of the couch and ignored us both with the magnificent indifference of a cat who has seen everything and found most of it unremarkable. I have a key to my own house. This sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. Having a key to your own house means that the door opens when you put the key in. It means that the home you have built is still yours to enter. It means that the life inside it, the rugs and the furniture and the plants and the cat and the particular quality of the afternoon light is still organized according to your own logic and not according to someone else's fear. I am 58 years old. I have had 1 cardiac event, and I manage my health carefully, and I have a follow-up appointment every 3 months, and I take my medication, and I walk every morning, and I tend my garden in the seasons when it needs tending. I am not ready to be managed. I am not ready to be transitioned. I intend to go on living in this house with this cat in this light until I decide otherwise or until my body decides otherwise, and I intend for that decision to be mine in either case. My daughter is scared. I know that. I hold it with the tenderness it deserves. And I also hold, with equal tenderness, the fact that her fear is hers to manage and my life is mine to live, and that those 2 things can coexist without one of them swallowing the other. They are learning to coexist. It is not a finished process. But the door opens when I put the key in, and that is how it starts. I want to say something to whoever is watching this, who is in either position. If you are the parent, if you are the person who has come home to change locks or moved furniture or brochures in the kitchen drawer or well-meaning arrangements made without your knowledge or consent, I want you to know that you are allowed to say no. You are allowed to say, "I understand your fear, and I do not consent to being managed by it." You are allowed to have the honest conversation, even when having the honest conversation is harder than accepting the management. Your life belongs to you. The decisions about it belong to you. The home you have built belongs to you. And if you are the child, if you are the one sitting in the car looking at the front door before you drive away and carrying the weight of the grief you have not yet experienced but can already feel in your body, I want you to know that the fear is real, and the fear is yours to feel, and the fear is yours to feel, and the fear does not entitle you to make decisions for the person you are afraid of losing. It entitles you to feel it. It entitles you to get help with it. It does not entitle you to change the locks. That line is not always visible until you have crossed it. I hope this story helps you find it before you get there. Thank you for being here until the very end. If this story landed somewhere real in you, like and subscribe and tell me in the comments. Tell me which side of the door you have been standing on. Tell me what side of the door you have been standing on. Tell me what the key felt like. I will see you next time.